The latest efforts to reduce the carbon footprint are coming from the European Union. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. A transitional period had begun this month for countries exporting goods to the EU, with South Korea being no exception. I want to bring in our trade correspondent Moon Hye-ryeon to talk about this issue. Welcome, Hye-ryeon.
Good evening, Jung-min.
Evening. And so what exactly is CBAM and what does the transitional period involve?
Right, so simply put, CBAM is a measure to prevent something called carbon leakages. It's what happens when a company moves its production facilities from a country with strict carbon emission policies to one with policies that are a bit more lax. With CBAM, production facilities based outside of the EU will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as sites within the bloc. The current system used in the EU is called ETS, the Emissions Trading System. South Korea was the second country in the world to implement it, so it's something we're familiar with. It's a cap-and-trade system where companies can buy allowances within a certain limit to account for their emissions. Any allowances that aren't used can be sold to other companies. The new CBAM mechanism will subject all companies importing goods into the EU to this system. But companies don't need to worry about this just yet. From the beginning of this month up until the end of 2025, only greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported, and that's without needing to make any financial payments. The first reporting period is until the end of January next year. So far, no companies in South Korea have submitted their reports. But from 2026, importers will need to declare the quantity of goods being brought into the EU in the preceding year, as well as what's called their embedded greenhouse gas emissions, which are greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production and transportation of goods. They will then have to surrender the relevant number of CBAM certificates priced at the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances.
And what does this mean for South Korean companies?
So for now, this only applies to companies producing 6 different goods that have been classified by the EU as carbon-intensive goods. These are cement, iron, steel and aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected. According to government data, steel exports to the EU totaled nearly $4.5 billion last year, while aluminium exports came to $540 million. This is no small amount, but steel and aluminium exports are predicted to drop by more than 1/5 as a result of CBAM. So why are exports expected to decline? A survey showed that more than half of South Korean companies who exported goods to the EU in the past and plan to do so in the future do not have any plans in place for CBAM. I spoke to an industry insider about the reasons behind this, and he gave 3. One is that the EU has not yet released detailed guidelines, so companies aren't able to fully prepare. Let's take a listen to the other 2 reasons.
Businesses with 30 to 40 employees have only 1 or 2 people that are in charge of dealing with carbon emissions. This means that they don't have the capacity to prepare for new situations like this. Another reason is that there are a lot of companies that lack knowledge or capacity for an organized MRV system.
So what is the MRV mechanism he just mentioned? And if the companies are feeling unprepared, what about the Korean government?
So MRV actually stands for Measure, Report and Verify, and is actually a key component of the government's response plan to CBAM. Think of the MRV as a basic tool to report carbon emissions. The government plans to provide funding to SMEs so they can implement it and expand consulting for employees about MRV. In an emergency economic meeting earlier this week, Finance Minister Chu had something to say about this.
We will consult with the EU to recognise domestic emissions costs. In addition, we will actively support technology development and facility investment to reduce carbon emissions for export items to the EU, such as hydrogen-reduced steel.
So far, the government has been busy preparing for the transitional period. In addition to forming a dedicated task force, local companies can use the current domestic emission calculation system to report to the EU until the end of 2025. The government also plans to open further negotiations with the Taxation and Customs Union of the EU next month, so we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Right, we will have to keep our eyes on it. Thanks for the report, Hye-ryeon.
My pleasure.